But I very much agree. As I said before, the Scientific American article was a piece of shit. All right, folks may have noticed last week that I discussed the article, the shameful, disgusting smear piece that Scientific American published bashing E.O. Wilson. If you were reading between the lines, they were bashing E.O. Wilson as racist. Well, I wasn't the only one to jump into that. Last week, around the same time as I released the video, this came to my attention, so I figured it would be good because it was an excellent piece, and there was actually an interesting something or another that happened with Scientific American, because what happened, actually, is Razib Khan here got together a whole group of scholars who were absolutely apoplectic that Scientific American had smeared E.O. Wilson as they did. And so they wrote a rebuttal that they sought to have published in Scientific American. And long story short, Scientific American refused to publish the rebuttal. I'm not surprised. If you cannot tell from my musings on this channel, I generally think very little of Scientific American as a publication. It has been I said in another group chat that it has been pretty much another group email chat with academic colleagues, that it has been pretty much a waste of my time from very much of my career and has published almost nothing meaningful to me as far as my career goes. Some of the older columns from the 60s that I got a hold of, those are awesome, some of them. But what Scientific American is now, and maybe that's a good video to do at some point, is to dig up an old article of Scientific American and compare it to a couple of them from now, just to get a sense. But anyway, let us go into this. From Razib Khan Substack, Unsupervised Learning. Personal note first. When E.O. Wilson died at the age of 92 last month, I mourned because his death was the destruction of a library. Many younger biologists who focus on mastering new statistical and computational methods lack the organismic knowledge that older generations accrued. Knowledge loss is real, no matter how fondly we cling to our modern expectations of eternal progress. And then there is the loss to history, as Wilson had so much back and forth with the giants from James Watson to Richard Lewontin. Older academics of his stature and vigor often alone retain insights and anecdotes that will disappear forever with their passing. For a vivid reminder of this truth, read Alison Drager's interview of Wilson from 2009. This is why Scientific American's publication of the complicated legacy of E.O. Wilson frankly left me aghast. Even my deep cynicism about our age's slackening standards did not prepare me for that op-ed. It seemed to have little to do with Wilson and everything to do with opportunistically shoehorning particular views about social justice into the practice of hard science. When Wilson was involved in many scientific debates and cultural issues, but since the fading of the 1970s sociobiology wars, his prominence as a controversialist had become a footnote to his advocacy for conservation and his role in debates over the utility of the inclusive fitness framework. So if you remember when I did the video on the smear piece itself, one of the rebuttals to it that came out last week also mentioned that E.O. Wilson was an avid conservationist and all sorts of amazing things that he had done. And you got to remember, from the peril of politicizing science, the whole problem with this is that just focusing on the ills of someone, you end up ignoring all the good things and what have you that they do in their work. Yes, they may have a whole lot of personal crap and things that you disagree with, but you end up with the great notion of what they do and the good things that they do getting ignored if you focus on all of that. With some exceptions, that's not a good thing to do in this case, is to ignore some of those. My immediate reaction was that the op-ed was indecent. It was muddled and uninformed at best, disrespectful and misleading at worst, along with many others. I expressed this view on social media and began to hear from yet more who weren't speaking publicly. I heard through the grapevine that multiple Scientific American staffers were embarrassed by the piece, and I was encouraged to submit a rebuttal. After a flurry of emails and direct messages, a few of us agreed that this shouldn't be allowed to stand without a rebuttal. Absolutely. What most people don't realize is, at least in journals, not so much in magazines, but at least in journals, there's a comment and reply kind of option for when you're publishing in a peer-reviewed journal. You can comment on something, somebody can reply, you can go back and forth in peer-reviewed published things that go back and forth for a while. So those things happen, and you should be expected to do that with Scientific American too, but as we'll see. Other scientists of some stature shared our disgust, but disagreed. They argued against dignifying something so unworthy with a response. I would give Scientific American undeserved oxygen and attention. Engagement with a publication that to many seems to have lost its way risked being more reward than rebuke. To be candid, I felt their approach, probably perfectly standard in past decades, was wholly out of step with today's dispensation, when attacks on science are legion, genuine fear of the social media mob is rampant in academia, and whole careers are canceled on a specious basis. Ignored long enough, the lie becomes canon. It wasn't difficult to find signatories to the rebuttal, and we could have collected hundreds. I stopped seeking names after a few dozen because the message is abundantly clear when you see who signed. Dr. Queller is one of the most prominent critics of Wilson's late foray against Hamiltonianism. Dr. David Sloan Wilson and Dr. Jerry Coyne both signed without hesitation. In other circumstances, they might have had some very pointed disagreements, but on this they concurred. Wilson, notably, was emphatic that we shouldn't engage in great man hagiography on the podcast I recorded with him. Some of those who signed no doubt share many political and social views with the author of the Scientific American piece. It's not my place to speak for them, but some made clear their sincere political goals are not served by association with sloppy smear jobs. Very true. A lot of things that aren't served with that, and unfortunately it tends to be a thing of wokeness and a thing of a lot of strict ideological viewpoints of the world, that you end up with those kinds of happy little smears that come along all the time. Wilson was not without faults, as I highlighted in the recent podcast I recorded with David Sloan Wilson and Charles Mann. Many scientists I know and respect have expressed skepticism and dismissal of some of Wilson's enthusiasms. Great scientists of the past are not gods any more than great scientists still among us, but humans with all the complexity that entails, which is to say we have our flaws. We can be very screwed up people personally and still do good work. We can also do some really crappy work if ideology gets in the way of the scientific method. Differences of opinion are nothing new in science. Sadly, baseless accusations of racism aren't either. Wilson negotiated plenty of each throughout his long career. A single 1981 instance where he defended himself and his science in the magazine Nature provides a striking contrast to today's case. In response to a letter published in a previous issue suggesting his own work gives cover to racists, Wilson penned his own calm, patient response addressing the accusations with facts. Nature ran both letters. Today, we are sitting on a rebuttal to Scientific American's prominent reprisal of Wilson for 8 days. Curious, given that the article was rushed out within 3 days of death, Editor-in-Chief Laura Hellmuth wrote to officially reject it. Scientific American avoids, she explained, quote, running direct rebuttals of earlier articles. This is standard practice in most magazines to avoid being too self-referential, and so each article stands on its own. Like I said, that's not true. Every peer-reviewed journal that I have found has a comment and reply option, that you can comment on an article, issue a comment statement on an article that's peer-reviewed. The authors can reply. You can go back and forth. You have plenty of rebuttals of each other that's out there in the public view. And yes, it can be a little self-referential, but that's not true. To avoid being self-referential, the point is not to avoid being self-referential. The point is to have the back and forth discussion in plain view of the rest of the scientific community, at least, if not the public at large. So no, that doesn't fly as an explanation for me either with Scientific American. Most of us can vividly recall a time when both journalism and science were robust enough to welcome, indeed require, the healthy airing of debates on important issues. Today, in contrast, contributors to a publication once dedicated to the diffusion of scientific ideas are deemed so sensitive their opinions cannot be directly discussed or debated. Not only that, their unvetted ad hominem attacks are automatically newsworthy, based, one gathers, on the logic behind Hellmuth describing her opinion section as for, quote, authors such as Monica McLarimore who present their own experiences and analysis. Which is to say, you can't challenge me, is the thing there. You can't challenge me. This is my feeling, therefore it is true. You can't challenge me. That's not the way the scientific method works. That is not the way the scientific enterprise works. Wokeness in a nutshell was what was in that Scientific American article. I don't want to live in a world where my interlocutors and I are so fragile that our ideas must, quote, stand on their own because we are presenting our own experiences. I want discussion. I want debate. I want to deserve the robust, roiling world of ideas that could forge and nourish a truth-seeking mind like E.O. Wilson's. Rest in peace, E.O. Wilson, but hopefully not the very values on which his prolific career depended. So that is Razib's opening letter. detailing the fact that Scientific American didn't publish this rebuttal. The rebuttal in question is here in Razib's Substack. And again, I will link this in the description and encourage you to go read it. I'm going to read it here and offer some of my thoughts and commentary. The great entomologist and evolutionary biologist E.O. Wilson died on December 26, 2021 at the age of 92. Within 3 days, Scientific American published a bewilderingly flimsy opinion piece that ignored his exceptional legacy of scholarship, innovation, and advocacy, instead using his passing to attack science's history of white empiricism and scientific racism. The piece suggests that Wilson's and other seminal thinkers' works were problematically, quote, built on racist ideas and calls for truth and reconciliation in the scientific record. Does not that scare the crap out of you just reading it again? To see truth and reconciliation applied to the scientific record, whatever that exactly means. Yeah, no, you don't rewrite history. We've said this over and over again. Oh boy. Wilson's scholarly treatises and popular books appeared over an astonishing span of 5 decades, and their visionary breadth and graceful prose inspired generations of scientists. His dozens of works include The Theory of Island Biogeography, Genes, Mind, and Culture, The Coevolutionary Process, Sociobiology, The Synthesis, Consilience, and the Future of Life. Among his countless awards were the 1990 Crawford Prize, non-medical biology's equivalent of the Nobel, and Pulitzer Prizes for the books On Human Nature and The Ants. Wilson, a lifelong conservationist, is often credited with kickstarting an evolutionary understanding of universal human behavior, as well as developing models foundational to ecological theory. No stranger to intellectual dust-ups, Wilson had for decades endured sometimes misplaced vitriol and ad hominem attacks. But he strived to uphold standards of integrity and instead insisted on putting science first, even when activists stooped to physically attacking him. Wilson was spared the indignity of reading Scientific American's mystifying reappraisal. But such a weakly sourced and misinformed piece raises troubling questions about the state of scientific inquiry and discourse. Quote, the complicated legacy of E.O. Wilson, end quote, is alarming, but because of any revelation about Wilson, not because of any revelation about Wilson, since it's hardly about him, but for the casual lapses in basic editing and fact-checking behind its extreme claims. And this actually makes a good point. From what I've read and heard of E.O. Wilson, he was very much about putting scientific practice first. I take issue with the language of putting science first because science is not a thing. It's the scientific practice and the pursuit of the truth. So I'm going to take a leap there and say that E.O. Wilson was all about the pursuit of the truth and the rigorous debate and discussion that needed to be involved in the pursuit of the truth. And I agree in a sense with what Razib here is saying, and his co-authors actually are saying about Scientific American's troubling. That piece was disgusting and disgraceful. I can get to much stronger words. Well, frankly, the Scientific American piece was a piece of shit. I will put it that way. But it's really alarming because there is such a lack of care for what is the truth in this situation. And that is really what needs to be asked in this situation. What was the truth about the man's life? I would love to know more about the man's complete life and everything he thought and all these kinds of things. I'm sure there was plenty of things I probably disagreed with him on. I'm sure there's plenty of things I probably agreed with him on. And it comes back to the not making assumptions based upon this time with wokeness and what have you. But unfortunately, the thing about woke, critical theory, postmodernism, woke is this nice short colloquial for a lot of that, is that they don't care about what the truth is. They care about power. And that is quite an obvious thing from all of their writings, not just from anything else going on. After time spent writing and researching and doing stuff, that is, again, all about power. And again, if you really want more on that, go to New Discourses. That's what I recommend. But the newdiscourses.com, that is. But that's just really what it is when wokeness gets invested in things. This is one of the reasons it's so bad to science. When wokeness gets invested in things, the pursuit of the truth goes out the window because it's not about the truth. When wokeness gets into science, it takes scientists away from their core purpose, their telos, the pursuit of the truth. And that's why I can't stand it. And why I'm running my mouth on YouTube and sharing videos out and what have you, to make the point that no, wokeness and critical theory have no place in science, because they are very much the antithesis of the scientific practice and the normative principles of science. They don't belong. Critical theory doesn't belong there. It will wreak havoc and ruin science. I hope you enjoy all the things that result from that. In The Complicated Legacy, Dr. Monica McLemore, professor of nursing and reproductive health at the University of California, San Francisco, unloads an arsenal of buzzy accusations on the late scientists, dragging in Francis Galton, Charles Darwin, Carl Pearson, and Gregor Mendel for critique in the process. She quotes Craig Venter and Francis Collins, but neglects to link their allusions to, quote, the complex provenance of ideas and the underinvestment in, quote, in the research on human behavior to, quote, widespread scientific racism in any way. And what specific evidence does McLemore present against Wilson or the 19th century scholarships she holds up for opprobrium? She claims to have intimately familiarized herself with Wilson's work, having enjoyed his fictional anthill, and thus being disappointed by sociobiology, which touches on humanity only in its 26th and final chapter. Because of its role in the orthodoxy that human differences, quote, could be explained by genetics, inheritance, and other biological mechanisms, but alas, she doesn't appear to have familiarized herself even with the basic science, because this proposition is empirically unassailable. Twin adoption, and DNA-level studies on millions of individuals consistently demonstrate that just about all human traits, from height to intelligence and personality, owe at least some, often much of their variation among individuals, to genetic influences, not to be confused with genetic determination, as in the opinion piece by McLemore. And yet, like Darwin, Wilson actually argued eloquently for a universal human nature, a premise that undermines racist agendas. It's very much true. If you're all about a lot of the things that unfortunately go on with the woke is they do make an awful lot of presumptions about people on the basis of things like skin color and sex and gender and what have you. That's not involved with that's not connected with universal human nature in the slightest. If you're focusing more, it's not connected with the universal human nature in the slightest that Wilson argued for. Wilson would be quite the opposite of the wokesters of today, and that's perhaps why they went after him. Furthermore, although McLemore apparently intended to damn Wilson by attributing to him this factual insight, it is not at all clear that the flowering of human behavior genetics even belongs in the ledger of Wilson's scientific accomplishments. The germ of behavioral genetics predates Wilson's insight by decades. The fact is, sociobiology helped pave the way for the other evolutionary approaches to human behavior, with a focus on understanding our human commonalities, as well as the nascent field of cultural evolution. More perplexing lapses in scholarship follow. McLemore lumps Wilson, born 1929, together with Pearson, Galton, Darwin, and Mendel, born between 1809 and 1857, castigating all for problematic and racist ideas. Galton, Pearson, and Darwin held Victorian views we find reprehensible today. But the enduring truth or falsity of a scientific theory does not depend on the anachronistic opinions of the scientists who helped develop it, which is to say, so has McLemore discovered bias in Wilson's legacy? So, which is to say, with that paragraph, is he's echoing what Anna Krylov wrote in The Peril of Politicizing Science. He's reckoning with the fact that just because somebody may have some beliefs that you find absolutely reprehensible, that doesn't mean you dislike their work or think their work is crap or that their scientific work and research is crap. Galton, Pearson, and Darwin did have some pretty reprehensible views in their lives. But a lot of their good research still stands today and has led to the development of many things today. So again, we don't weigh a person's scientific work and their value in the scientific research side of things based upon their personal beliefs. That's not something we're supposed to do, with the exception of when we know their personal beliefs have influenced the science, which is in the case of some scientific studies, and for example, think Trofim Lysenko, that definitely has happened in some cases. But with regards to everything else, nope, don't let it do. Here, the author proceeds only to demonstrate a baffling ignorance of one of the most basic concepts in modern statistics. This was hysterical when I read it in the Scientific American article. Calling on her expertise in public health, she claims, quote, the so-called normal distribution of statistics assumes that there are default humans who serve as the standard that the rest of us can be accurately measured against. End quote. But this is nonsense. Far from a conspiracy of biased humans, the normal distribution is a widely observed feature of the natural world. Across the animal and plant kingdoms, traits like human birth, weight, and height, cucumber length, bovine milk production, indeed any trait with many random independent variables at play, can often be found to approximately follow a normal distribution. Normal simply refers to the probability distributions with a certain mathematical form, the value-neutral outcome of random variables that have hewed to certain patterns. I'll give you one extra one. That tends to follow a normal distribution. Your daily high temperature. Take hundreds of days, daily high temperature, hundreds, thousands of days of daily high temperature, go over many years of daily high temperatures. I guarantee you it follows an almost normal curve. Same thing for daily low temperature. Almost normal curve. That's another thing. Almost normal distribution in both of them. Finally, we learn that, quote, the description and importance of ant societies as colonies is a component of Wilson's work that should have been critiqued. It beggars belief that among the most serious defenses the author could dredge up from a wildly prolific career built on racist ideas was Wilson's use of the term ant colony, a standard term that for cohabitating groups of ants, wasps, and bees in entomology. Perhaps it is by this logic that she also invites us to condemn Mendel, the father of genetics, whom she counts among Wilson's intellectual forebears and who published works and spoke theories fraught with racist ideas. Is Mendel, the Augustinian monk, famously pottering over his pea plants in obscurity, now racist for discovering the law of segregation, or because he found that yellow peas are genetically dominant over green? Following this uncompelling evidence, the author puts forward 3 suggestions for the health of science. She calls for new methods in science, an odd plea in the age of CRISPR and ubiquitous whole genome sequencing, quote, diversifying the scientific workforce, a massive and important priority in academia today, and finally, quote, truth and reconciliation in the scientific record. The idea of a scientific record is hard to interpret, but she suggests citational practices to flag problematic work and unironically nominates humanities scholars, journalists, and other science communicators to make these judgments. There is one point on which we can agree with McLaramore. It is true, quote, it is true that work both can be important and problematic. They can coexist. Therefore, it is necessary to evaluate and critique these scientists considering specifically the value of their work. Indeed, this is how science has always proceeded. Unfortunately, McLaramore continues, quote, and at the same time their contributions to scientific racism. Alas, Scientific American's readers will find neither a clear definition of this sinister undercurrent, nor any instances of its actual existence in Wilson's thought. It surely says more about the spirit of our age than it does about Wilson and that the editors of Scientific American chose to mark the passing of a scientist of his stature by debating baseless accusations of racism. A line Wilson penned to Nature in 1981 has aged well. Quote, to keep the record straight, I am happy to point out that no justification for racism is to be found in the truly scientific study of the biological basis of social behavior, end quote. Wilson's insights speak for themselves, and his dozens of worthy titles allow us to grapple with his actual ideas directly. His books are suffused with an abiding gratitude gratitude for and humble lifelong wonder at the complexity of our natural world. Their impact will long outlive any hasty and poorly informed appraisals of his legacy. That's pretty much what I want to say, and Razib, thank you for pulling this together because I very much agree, and thank you to all of your colleagues for signing it. I know there were, thank you for all of your colleagues for signing it. I was going to say something else, but that's not important here. But I very much agree. As I said before, the Scientific American article was a piece of shit. No other way to say it. I mean, I'm sorry for being very blunt with that, but that is what it is with that Scientific American article. And I am thrilled to start seeing more and more of pieces like this. There's more and more folks fighting back. Most of you may not be familiar, but there's a community now also that is the heterodox STEM community that many of those those who are members of that community are actually very adamantly pushing back against the woke in their academic circles, which I'm very pleased to see at this point. And glad to actually know a few of the members there, met a few of them. So I appreciate it, and I think that's it for now. Take a go read of it and let me know what you think here, and what do you think of Scientific American refusing to publish this rebuttal, which was very well done. And that said, I think that's it for now. If you like this video, hit the like button on the way out the door, comment on the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel, all that good jazz, and don't forget to subscribe to Locals. Thursday Review is going to be on the rise and fall of rationality in language, which is going to be a very interesting study here, and following Thursday Thoughts for supporters only on Locals. So if you want to be a part of that, you have to join and become a supporter of Locals. That's it for now. I will see you all next time. Until next time, I'm Adrian. I hope you stay curious, my friends.